Good afternoon, and welcome to another set of series in which we continue to talk a little bit about human resources, shared parameters, and in few of my videos that I have actually published, we talk about the human resources parameters, and we're going to continue to configure the human resources module up until we get into the process perspective, and then we'll eventually hire an employee for a position. So right now we're still setting up the human resource module, and today we're going to talk about the human resources shared parameters and some of the new functionality that have been enabled by Microsoft. So you're familiar with the home screen, and of course I don't need to go too much into detail about how this home screen looks like, but if you were to go into human resource shared parameters under modules, if you go into the module itself and right underneath setup, you have human resources shared parameters. You see a start there, and I think I might have mentioned it quite a few times. This is simply to add it to your favorites. So if you're frequently going into the parameters, then you might as well put it in under favorites. So you simply go on the top and then navigate your way through that. As a consultant, it's always easier to simply have quite a few of those parameters and setup tables that you're going to be visiting from time to time to configure, to retest, and to, of course, change things around as you're implementing the solution and as the client is testing. So it's always easier to have this under the favorites. So if you click on human resources shared parameters, we all talked about what the difference is between human resource parameters and shared parameters. If not, to visit my other video and you would be able to differentiate what the difference is between the two. And today we're going to start talking about number sequences actually. So we've talked about number sequences for human resource parameters. It's the same concept, except that within the shared parameters, it is being used at a global level. So you have a personnel number, and we have actually coded a number sequence for a personnel. If you like to know how you can configure it, I did configure it in the human resource parameters video, so do have a quick look at that. There's some fields and toggle buttons that I've talked about which are very relevant for implementation and for the decision-making process for the client. So do make sure that you have a good understanding of that. So for the number sequences for human resource shared parameters, you could see that the position, we have a number sequence for positions. And of course, positions are shared across all legal entities. So that's why we get to configure the number sequence for position at a shared parameter. Same thing with the IA9 document. This is very relevant to the United States. Since this license has been, my demo environment is sort of licensed to a US and Canada. So you see I-9 document, not very relevant, haven't really used it in a Canadian entity because there's no use to it. I-9 documents belong to the US. Applicant, so if you have the applicant tracking system integrated into Dynamics 365 F&O, then it takes this number sequences. So of course, every applicant that you send from your ATS system needs to have some form of a new number assigned to it, a unique number. So this is where you configure that. And there's a lot more to it, of course, when you get into the design of the integration. It's not simply just mentioning the referencing the number sequence code for it. There's a lot about mapping that you need to know. And we might talk about how that works, the language, the verbiage that is being used within the IT consulting space. So, I will create a separate video for that, and then we'll go and talk about what kind of a language we use in front of a client and what relevant and applicable things are there when you walk into a client's call or a client's meeting, and what are the different steps that I have taken to actually learn my way through being a good consultant. So some few tips that I would like to share in upcoming videos. So moving on with the other resource parameters within the number sequence form, you have discussion, something to do with the performance, so you can assign a unique number. Not very relevant, to be honest. I haven't used it personally. Personnel action is a totally different video on its own. So personnel action, just to give you a highlight, this parameter has to do with some form of an action that you take, and And if you enable this personnel action, which is down here in one of these menus, then you have to assign a workflow associated with it. So a personnel action could be hiring somebody, or transferring an employee from one position to another, or terminating an employee. So these are different actions that you can take and assign a workflow. So in human resource parameters, you cannot assign a workflow to an action automatically. For instance, in accounts payable, when we talk about accounts payable at some point, when we finish configuring the HR module, you have a payment journal, and you can associate a workflow to a payment journal. So you don't need a personnel action for that. You simply create a vendor payment, create the line, and submit it for an approval. But in this case, in HR modules, you need to go through and configure personnel actions. So you cannot hire an employee unless you configure this. So that is why the personnel action plays a key role, and it is intact with the workflow. So we'll talk a little bit about that, how that works, when we get to the workflows. Benefit ID, totally different. Video on its own. Benefits management is a new module, relatively new module now, and a whole new set of series would be required for us to configure the benefits management. So benefit ID basically takes that number sequence when we're creating these benefits. The goal, you're quite familiar with it. It's self-intuitive. So it has to do with the performance. So if you were to create a new goal, depending on which employee you are or you're a manager, it simply takes that specific number sequence and it assigns it to you. So that unique goal is assigned to you. So if you go into the system and search up that number, and it will give you that goal, and then it'll tell you how that's assigned. So that's also a separate topic we might touch at some point when we talk about performance reviews. User request ID. So within the system, you don't have the opportunity to request a user. So when we talk about system administrations and users and whatnot, so that is a separate process. So in this human resource shared parameters, user request ID simply does not play too much of a role. You can assign any number sequence to it, to be honest. It's from a process perspective, it has to do with the workflow. So if you initiate a workflow, for instance, it will simply stamp your user ID. So that's the request that you created. So it kind of ties down with the personnel action, but nothing that you would want to talk to your client about because it's irrelevant, and they wouldn't really care about what the number sequence is being used at the back end. So it has to do with the back end anyway. The employment and process ID. So as you could see, there's some description that allows you to figure out what this is about. So for employment, it's just a unique key for the employment. So this goes hand in hand with the process when you're hiring an employee. So do make sure that the employment number sequence isn't blank. Otherwise, you'll have a hard time hiring somebody because the personnel number is not going to get triggered. So employment and then personnel number and then the personnel action, for instance, they kind of tie together. So you don't necessarily have to have the same number sequence. Of course, it's a unique key, but make sure you do have it. That's also has to do with the backend. So the system is basically assigning the employment unique ID to an employee when you're hiring them. And the process ID, so it's basically an identifier for a benefit eligibility process run. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the benefits management. But this is a simple number sequence, a unique number sequence that is assigned when you run the eligibility process of benefits. Moving on to the positions, and these two this is a relatively new, the lock descriptions for position. So basically, if I were to enable this, I will show you how this would have an impact, but it basically locks the description piece of that position. So nobody should be allowed to change that description, and we'll see where that falls in. And this is very important, so you should have this enabled. So you must require department on position. So a lot of times in HR implementations, you could create a position without a department, but it just simply sits in the system. So you want to make sure that you can control it. By enabling this, you make that field mandatory. So when you create a new position, then a department is required for you to proceed with creating that position. So this is where that Boolean field comes in. and assign the positions across the organization. So that's basically a drop-down menu says either always or never, and when you create a position, you're able to see it across all legal entities. That's what this is. So it's always good to have it because it's a shared parameter. So we won't talk about the personnel action, but let me touch base on the last piece about the locking the description, and in my next video we'll pick it up from the personnel actions, and I'll show you how you can even configure that and how that plays a role with the workflow. So if I were to go into human resources again, and I'm assuming that this lock description for position is enabled, and I would go into any active position or any position in general, and then I'll select the very first one just for a demonstration purposes. And if I click the first one, we see that this is the description. So right now I can edit that description if I were to like, and I can simply save it. With that toggle button, this would be grayed out and nobody would be allowed to change the description. The only time you can change the description is basically when you create new position, and at that point you would have to add the description in there. In this case, as you could see, that the department is not required, so there is no asterisk tag there. So I can skip this piece and I would have to have a job assigned to this position. So with that, I'll leave the investigation to you, and we'll continue talking about how do you configure this, and then we'll eventually start talking about the processes, and we'll pick it up from personnel action in the next video.